Welcome, everyone, to the Tulsa World Opinion Podcast. I am here with my friend Barry Friedman, the king of Tulsa County comedy, the
Tulsa
godfather of
County.
funny people. What other kind of monikers can we give you?
Oh, I probably do some writing, have a website, talk about politics, but we can go with comedy.
Freedom of the Plains.
We can go with comedy.
Freedom
Freedom
of
of
the
the
Plains.
Plains.
So,
There you go.
so this is a bonus twice 1 week because the mayor's race. And what's funny about you, Barry, you usually know nothing about local and state politics. You are like
Yes,
Mr. National Politics.
I know.
But you have been wound up about these local races, which I appreciate. I wish other people
Well,
would.
let's just review the first rule of politics that nobody knows anything, right? It's like
Right.
all the people who said, Biden's going to drop out and Democrats will coalesce around Harris. She'll open up like a 3 to 5 point lead nationally, and Donald Trump will self-destruct. Remember, that was predicted by absolutely nobody in the middle of June. Nobody. So this election for the mayor was predicted by absolutely nobody. Now, some people said, yes, Karen Keith and Monroe Nichols would be in the runoff. Nobody had Monroe Nichols winning. Nobody had the entire race, 700 votes between the three of them, among the three of them. So this once again proves that nobody knows anything. Let's just stop there.
I
We
just
can
feel
end.
like the polling we've talked about this before. I don't know if there's good polling out there. Like I don't know. I mean, I went and studied this back 20 years ago in a master's program, but now to capture a true sample of voters and how they vote, I'm just like, you know what? Our gut check is as good as anything. And I have had friends who just predicted just off the top of their heads, they were as good as the polling. I mean, it's so, but but we had the three: Karen Keith, Monroe Nichols, Brent Van Norman.
Mhm.
When we last spoke, I said there's only two of those that are qualified. I still stand by that.
Right.
Um, but it you're right. 710 votes is what separated the first place, Monroe, and the third place, Brent Van Norman. And I will say, I think it's very cool that history was made that a Black person won the most votes in a mayoral race. There is a runoff because he didn't win the 50%, but that alone, I think, is a pretty cool thing for Tulsa to have achieved.
The
And
other thing,
I do credit that with a campaign of ideas, honestly. Um, what I was a little surprised, um, maybe a little disappointed that the hyper partisan campaign that Brent Van Norman waged, it maybe made a difference and got him that close. I mean, this is a person who's only lived in Tulsa for 3 years, has served on no Tulsa or Oklahoma boards, commissions. He came here on Tulsa remote 3 years ago. Um, I was a
which
little
is another
surprised that
story.
he got traction.
Well, he had the brand though. And if you're a Democrat in Tulsa County, but certainly in Tulsa City, that this is a pretty heartening election. Now, what's the last election anybody can remember in Oklahoma where for Democrats there's not a bad outcome?
Mm.
Every Democrat voting in November is probably going to think to him or herself, you know what? I prefer one or the other, but if either one of them wins, it's a victory for Tulsa.
Oh, I
And
do
I
think
think
you have. I do think you have the best qualified candidates there, and I don't think that the city is going to implode on itself between Monroe and Karen. But I do remember our last conversation. You were already bothered because you are the voice of the liberals. Can I use that? Is that another title?
the voice of the bothered is really, yeah, okay, the
Voice of
voice
the
of the
bothered.
liberal.
But
Just
you
don't
were
add the
you were
liberals.
already you were already seeing progressives tear each other apart over this, which we
Right,
have seen in conservatives for a
right.
while now. I mean, you look in the legislative races, conservatives are just taking each other down on who can be more extreme, who's biting at each other. So are we going to see more of that between now and November?
I think we will, but I also think at the end of the day, terrible cliche, it's not going to matter. Most people going into that voting booth in November going to know, you know what, I again prefer one or the other, but I can live with one or the other. And I'm sure it's going to get partisan. I'm sure it's going to get a little nasty, but it's not going to get as nasty as it was. And the fact is that I think had one of them not made the runoff by today, Thursday, the other one would have endorsed the one who did stay in. I really do think that that's where we are now. That was probably the most heartening thing about this. We have two candidates who, again, there's not that much difference between them. Stylistically, perhaps one is a better candidate, one has more money, but on the substance, on issues, I think they're both pretty complementary to each other and complementary to each other. And so I think to that extent, we're going to see some campaigning. We're both going to go, oh, this is ridiculous. Why are they doing this? But what's the outcome? What's the difference? One of them is going to be mayor. And that pretty much is the prize out there. I mean, it's not like had Nichols or Keith trashed the other one to such an extent they didn't make the runoff, then we could say, you see what you did to each other? Now we're going to have Van Norman. That's not going to happen now. And I think if anybody is going to be upset about the results, it's Republicans. 700 votes. He was 400 votes from making the runoff. What does that tell you? 28% turnout?
Yeah, we'll get to that. I will say there are some differences though. And the thing about Brent Van Norman that always bothered me was why him? Like, this is a person who doesn't know Tulsa. And I kind of wonder if they would have been better off with Jamie Fowler. I mean, at least Jamie Fowler, before he dropped out to seek his seat, he's from Tulsa. He's sat on so many Tulsa boards. He's donated money. When you're looking for someone who can run the city, you have to actually know the city, the people living in it. And that's where I'm floored, and I'm a little disappointed in that, because he also was on a stage with a Christian nationalist preacher and with Ryan Walters, and that showed he either believed in this Christian nationalist rhetoric that's very divisive and harmful, or it's theatrics. And so you didn't know. But I will say, going back to your point, there's not much difference between Karen and Monroe, but there is. Karen, because now it's like, where those 18,000 votes go that Van Norman had. Karen's already leaning into that conservative messaging, and you know her as a friend. Most people do not. So when she says in her ads, I'm going to work with police to get rid of homelessness, that is a message to conservatives. They like that idea of pro-cop, we're going to keep arresting these people. But in actuality, that is not the solution. I mean, we know that the police don't want to spend all their time just arresting homeless people. Vic Regalado at the sheriff's office, he doesn't want a jail full of untreated, undiagnosed, mentally ill homeless people who that's what we're talking about. So that messaging is toward the conservative end. And so does she believe that? Or is this strategy?
Well, that's where the votes are. Those 17, 18,000 Van Norman votes are up for grabs. I don't think anybody who wanted to vote for Nichols didn't. I think he got everybody who wanted to vote for him. I think Karen Keith probably got most of who wanted to vote for or would vote for her. I'm sure there are Republicans out there now who are looking at these two candidates, Nichols and Keith, going, what do I do now if they don't stay home? The majority of Van Norman supporters go where? Do they go to Karen Keith? Do they go to Monroe Nichols? I think they go to Karen Keith. It's smarter for her to play for them.
But is it real? That's where I'm getting at. Is that it is kind of interesting. A friend of mine said, he goes, when the far right strays, it's strategy, but when the far left does it, it's heresy. It's like, because what you're seeing is some of that progressive base that she had, they're offended by that. They're like, wait, we don't want, we want to know, are you really going to arrest all the homeless people? I'm just using that as an example because that was just one of the things that came out right before the race. Or do both of them just play it on why play to any side? I mean, why play to that if you don't believe it? Or maybe you do believe it. That's what I'm asking. What is real, Barry?
I mean, you'd have to ask her. All I know is politically, that was where the votes are. And the Republicans who supported Keith will continue supporting Keith. And the Republicans who didn't support Keith, where will they go? And again, I'm sure if you're Karen Keith, I'm sure if you're a Democrat who wants to win, you say, look, let's play the long game here. The important thing is that we win here. And this is how we win. And there are issues that perhaps conservatives and Democrats can agree on. Homelessness, I don't know if it's one of them, but I know there are a lot of shop owners, a lot of restaurant owners who have a different take on homelessness than people who don't. And I'm sure in Karen's mind, I haven't talked to her about this, I'm sure in her mind, she's addressing those real concerns. Now, it's a sellout, perhaps, heresy, perhaps, but politically speaking, that's where the election is going to be won, those 17, 18,000 votes.
So how
Unless
much
you
does race
think
play
that,
into that, though? You say the
oh,
Republicans won't vote for Monroe.
that is a
Is
good
it
question.
because
I
he's a
don't know how
black
much
man,
race.
or is it because of
I,
his policies?
uh, look, the better angels, worse angels. I mean, I'm not sure how many people would vote for Monroe Nichols. How many people would have voted for him had been no Karen Keith in the race, and it just been Monroe Nichols and Brent Van Norman? What kind of election do we have on Tuesday? What do you
I
think?
really don't know. It's interesting looking precinct to precinct. There was a story in today that Van Norman won most of the precincts,
Mhm.
but Monroe got more votes. And it was almost predictable where it was the precincts south. Monroe took all the north and midtown, but the south and the east went to Van Norman. And so I don't know how that plays out. And like I say, and I don't know. I mean, the whole idea of Republicans won't vote for Monroe, it's like, well, you said there's not a whole lot of difference between Monroe and Karen. Then what's the difference? Why wouldn't they vote for Monroe?
Well,
I mean, to be honest, I mean, and if voters were honest with themselves about how they do vote.
those are the worst angels who will play into it. I mean, to say the race isn't a factor in American politics is to not know American politics. It just is. Now, this was actually heartening for those who say, no, race isn't as much of a factor as you think. Monroe Nichols, again, nobody predicted him winning. Now, I don't care how small he did win. And that's encouraging for Monroe Nichols, right? And if you're Karen Keith, I would imagine you'd say, listen, he is a more his candidacy is exciting more people than ours. And if there's anything that Monroe Nichols should take great joy in is that happened. That, 3, 4 weeks ago, people were talking about Karen Keith winning this outright.
Mhm.
She barely made the runoff, and that was in less than a month. So there's some hope there for people who think that Monroe Nichols is the change candidate and that Tulsa needs a change mayor. But for those who are looking at this thinking, all right, now where do those 17, 18,000 Van Norman voters go? You tell me why they go to Monroe Nichols. What Monroe Nichols is saying to those Republicans that make them more comfortable about going to him than Karen Keith is saying to those Republicans who'd be more comfortable going to her. What's that messaging to them? Because they will decide this election.
So where does the presidential race is going to make a difference? So you can look at it two ways, which is first, and we will get to the incredibly low voter turnout, but we had 26% of people, registered voters, voting in this election. It is the lowest turnout since at least 1992. I'm trying to go further back, but it's challenging getting into the data there. But the presidential race will probably bring out maybe 50%. That's the most it's had. I mean, even with when Trump and Hillary, they still 50% cared. But this presidential election, you're going to have more of your Trump voters coming out, but you also might have the effect of Kamala Harris, the first Black and Asian American woman come out. So if you are I mean, it depends on, this sounds so stupid, depends on who votes, right? Who
Right.
is going to be motivated to come out to vote? So is Trump going to motivate his base to come out to vote? Maybe Kamala Harris is motivating her base, new voters, people who typically weren't excited about the same old.
Well, why didn't Republicans come out for Van Norman? I mean,
I
the
still don't think he was
Republicans,
the right candidate. I mean, if you really wanted a conservative, which they shouldn't be, because there's nothing in the city that is Republican or Democrat. It's usually just city stuff. But even if you wanted someone to run on that, why go with someone who's only been here 3 years and has no investment whatsoever? That's where I'm like, if there are better conservatives that could have been put up if that's the person you want. That
So
was
who
always
decided?
my thinking, is maybe they just weren't excited about the candidate.
Would they have excited about anybody in town? Can you imagine?
I don't know. I mean, it's like polling, Barry. No, it's all gut checks right now.
Or is Tulsa moved to the point where, again, politics is not, as you say, all politics is not national. Who knows even know if it's local? It's just personal now, right? Most of these, I mean, I haven't been around that much, but I mean, more people know these mayoral candidates personally than I've ever heard of, right? People, you see it on Facebook. Well, I know Karen, I know Monroe. Everybody knows
Right.
somebody.
And I don't think people knew Brent Van Norman.
And that may be part of it, right?
Mhm.
But the other thing is, maybe G.T. Bynum's greatest legacy to Tulsa is that he took that away
Mhm.
from Tulsa. That it's not a city anymore where brand politics matters. I mean, I know we don't have a good breakdown, but registered Democrats, registered Republicans, do we know how many of each voted?
No, I
Because
looked into that. That data comes out later. I already kind of wondered that myself, but that we'll find out. That's not out yet. So,
would it be
and we
safe to
have
say
a
more
lot of
than
independents. I mean, in Tulsa, the city of Tulsa, again, it's 87% Republicans, 80, not 80%, like 80,000 Republicans, 80,000 Democrats, and like 50,000 independents.
Okay, what separates an independent Tulsa voter from a sane Democratic voter and a sane Republican voter?
Maybe
One
they're
who,
just turned off by or either they don't want to join a party.
yeah,
I think it's just they don't want to, they just don't like the organized parties.
or they want to be talked about afterwards as being the.
I know you're very cynical about that. So here's what do people want to hear though? Okay, so between now and November, um, it'll be interesting to see how, because Karen's campaign didn't have a lot of specifics, and I think I have a feeling we'll be starting to see more of that to figure out what is the difference, what kind of leader do you have, but what do you think people want to hear? For me and for the people in my bubble, we want to hear actual plans. Like, what are in the first 100 days? What are 10 things you're going to do or 5 things you're going to do? That's what I'm looking for. What are you hearing? What do you think people want to hear in the next 60 days?
Well, when I ask people what are the 5 biggest problems in Tulsa, if you had to list them,
Mm-hmm.
you usually get homelessness somewhere in the top 5. You get affordable housing somewhere in the top 5. Um, that's pretty much the only 2 I'm hearing. Then you hear about traffic lights and street conditions and stuff, but that's going to be all the time. So those 2 issues, I think, um, will have to be addressed. And the other issue I think that has to be addressed, and again, I'm not being cynical here, is the other thing that should be addressed is where is Tulsa in terms of Oklahoma? Where is it in terms of the United States? What is the vibe about Tulsa? I mean, the whole business of we are, in Oklahoma, but not of Oklahoma. Tulsa gets some very good press, has gotten some very good press, very good um, publicity, very good notices from a lot of important people. And to me, this is just me now. I think that's a very important thing to keep going.
Oh, I
Tulsa
do. Yeah. I
standard.
mean, so it
And I
is.
think the
You set the
person who
tone,
articulates that the best.
right? Like
Also,
what is the future? And again, that's why Monroe, I think, stood out. He has a plan that like gets us through 2030. He like sees Tulsa in 10 years and his role in it. Now, some of that may, like I say, may be aspirational, but I think that's what people are looking for, is that the mayor's job is incredibly difficult. And the way GT described it was 90% of it we don't see. It is actually managing the day-to-day intricacies of $1 billion business. In $1 billion company, that most of its employees are merit protected. So it's not like a private business where you can come in and no, you have to know public policy. But that 10%, I think, is that public facing, where you're setting the tone, what's that vision for the future? You are doing that. And is that sort of where you're getting at?
yeah, in some universities, they have I think they call it a 2 in a box, where the president and provost run the university, and the provost runs the university, and the president goes out and raises money and is the face of the university. Well, in Tulsa, that mayor does both.
Right.
Right. And the 90% we don't see is the 90% we drive over when the roads are terrible, the lights aren't on, right? But that 10% I think is what we do see. And that's the 10% that right now it's sure, and I agree with you, Monroe Nichols is doing a better job than Karen Keith. I think Karen Keith's strength right now is that she knows government, she knows how this works, she knows whose door to knock on. And I think she presents a more, if you could call this, more credible, competent administration on day one. I don't know if that's accurate, but I'm sure that's what she's going for. And Monroe Nichols, I don't think it's quite cracked that yet. Do you get that sense that he is running?
What I compared, like I say, I'm not personal friends with either of them. So I'm
Right.
like your typical person where I can go by what has been presented. And this is what I'm going to do on day one. He can tell you the titles of the people he was going to hire around him, the offices he's going to create. I can see what he's planning on doing. Karen is, yes, she's been a county commissioner for 16 years.
Right.
It's very different than the city. Just like Monroe, he's been a legislator for 8 years. It's very different. She's kind of like, trust me, I'm Karen. I know people,
Right.
I have no doubt about that. But if you don't know her like you are, I think the average voter is looking for more. Like
Well, by the
what?
same token, I'm sorry, same token, Monroe hasn't had the money to tell people
Right. I mean,
what you
I
know.
mean, that alone is pretty startling because she definitely has outraised. She has the what is the word I'm looking for? She has the depth of those relationships of people in power, of the people, the establishment. I mean, certainly the establishment likes her. They've known her a long time. I mean, that's a difference of, you have someone who's 70 and been in public service for a lot longer, and someone who's 40 and hasn't been around to establish those. So they're different circles, but she has the
And
many people that
and
behind them.
Monroe Nichols got here on that feel alone.
Right.
That he won this election because people had a better feeling about him and
Right.
where his vision of Tulsa, even if it is aspirational, because that works for a lot of people.
Right.
And
And
so
I
that
think
to his
Karen just has to maybe reestablish herself, that while the establishment does know her, and feels good about her, she has to introduce herself to the greater voters, because not everyone knows her. They know of her, she has name recognition, but I think that we'll start seeing more and be able to speak more to that. But what do you think about city council? We have 3 runoffs. Lori Decker Wright, who absolutely is one of the hardest working city councilors I've
right.
ever met. If we lost her in city council, I'm floored because she does so much. She should have won outright. And then we have
The
Anthony
Bush Fowler
Archie
issue.
and Stephanie Riesendorf. I've not met her, and I'm sorry, I've just butchered that last name. And then you have Carol Bush and Jamie Fowler.
That to me is the most interesting race because
Jamie Fowler, Carol Bush.
yeah, because Carol Bush is like Karen Keith, every Democrat's favorite Republican.
Mhm.
And for good reason.
Right.
I'm not knocking her. And she's going to need Democratic support to win that. Because again, I think the people who want to vote for Fowler did. I think who didn't vote for Fowler, those are the people out there for Carol Bush. What does she say to those people that will get those Democratic voters, I assume the Democratic voters, who will vote for her? And I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic and an interesting position for Democrats in this part of the country to be in. We're actually needed now. We're going to decide things now.
Well, in
People have to
Tulsa, in the
talk to
city of
us now.
Tulsa,
Yeah,
in that
people have to
district.
come talk to us now.
Right. Well, Carol Bush has always been a moderate. She's
Right.
always, I mean, she bucked her own party at times, and I look for that in Democrats as well. I mean, she's like I say, I think she's great. Jamie he's fumbled in the past with some of his
Well, he promised
but
not
you
to
know
run.
what? No matter what you think about Jamie Fowler, I do think he's genuine in liking Tulsa. I mean, I don't like his policies. I think some of the things he did were, kind of out there, and I think he was trying to go far right to try to get support from a base. I don't think he's a bad guy, but I do see Carol as being she's accomplished a lot in the legislature in another place. And she got 40% of the vote. I mean, and he got 26%. So I mean, she's already pretty ahead.
Here's my question for you. The GOP outsmart itself by saying that Van Norman would be a better candidate than Fowler. Now, Van Norman came within 400 votes of making the runoff. Do you think Fowler makes the runoff? Do you think if they don't make that change?
I don't know. He did but that's kind of a problem too. You get someone completely unknown, they don't have the background.
Right.
You get someone who's been around, yeah, you have stuff you can hold against a person. And isn't that sort of the crazy double-edged sword? That someone who's actually been around and tried to do something, that's held against the person, where, someone who just sort of showed up is like, gets more the nod because they're saying what they need to say. So I don't know much about the other race. And again, Lori Decker Wright, she never seems to be able to get that 50% to pass a runoff. I don't know who the 400 people are who voted for Margie Alfonso, but she's the person that you call up and she can rattle off how many people in her district walk to work, how many people in her district are considered homeless. She helped get Shields. She is kind of a force behind a lot of things, and she doesn't get credit for. And her district would end up with nothing if it would be harmed if she didn't get in there, because I don't think her opponent, while a nice guy, he's one of those, he wants to defund everything. He wants to defund. He said he wanted to stop paying for libraries, because why do we need public libraries? We have the internet. I mean, it's that kind of thinking. He doesn't want to fund any arts. We do have a government to run. We do have municipal things we have to have. So
I have a question for you. I have a question for you. We got time?
Sure. We got a few minutes. Couple minutes. Let's go.
Here's my question. Do you think there's an underlying angst in Tulsa?
An underlying what?
Angst, pain,
angst,
discomfort
angst.
In Tulsa.
Okay, angst.
Right. Angst,
okay.
Angst. Unhappiness.
Okay.
Uncomfortableness. Okay. That propelled Monroe Nichols that we all missed. Is there something going on in Tulsa that we're missing? Because again, my sense from the beginning was that G.T. Bynum would have won and a third term if he wanted it, right? Mm-hmm. Which meant to me that Tulsans were not that unhappy with the way things were.
Right.
So Karen Keith, as we talked about, in some respects ran as an incumbent, and she wasn't. And that turned off enough people. They went to Monroe Nichols, especially the Democrats. What's going on in Tulsa, do you think, that has not been reported that he captured? He had no money.
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know if it's angst or anger or discontent, or if it's something different. And Monroe's been around a while. He's not an unknown person. Karen is just more well-known.
Right.
I think that there are enough people, though, who fear change. And when I think of those 18,000 Van Norman votes, I think there's more people who are and I think that fuels a lot of, I think, some of the conservatism, is that change scares people. Mm-hmm. And so I think there are people who want change and that they're looking for that. But does that outnumber those who are fine with things, don't want things to change? I don't know.
Well, we are at that point in Tulsa where, again, you want that change. You want it to be an aspirational city, but Tulsa's greatest strength to me has always been there's always plenty of parking. So you want both, and maybe we're at that crossroads now where we have to decide which one of these are we going to double down on.
Right, and that's going to be what we're going to find out in November. So I'll say, I want more people to vote. Again, 26%. That's shameful. 75% of people decided they did not want to vote for mayor or their city councilor.
What are we all bitching about on Facebook? What are we all fighting about if 26% of the people went out to vote? What is all this passion about? What is all this rancor about if 26% of Tulsans go out and vote?
Right. And so next time someone wants to complain to me about city business, I'm like, did you vote? Because 75% chance you didn't. So, well, we are about out of time. We're gonna do this more. Maybe next week we talk about something else. We'll find something. Barry will be upset about something, guys. So no doubt.
We'll get something else. We'll predict something else wrong.
Exactly. We'll be completely off on. So
Yeah.
it was an interesting race. I think it'll I'd say I feel good about either candidate. I think that Tulsa is not gonna implode. And I think it at least starts some discussion and conversation about some real serious issues. So anyway, everyone take care.
Always good.